Yes, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and I hope you're continuing to enjoy my video content with regards looking at these old classic and vintage dirt bikes from back in the day. Now, if you haven't already subscribed to my video channel, I do hope you will consider doing that very small thing, because we do have some very nice bikes coming up in the weeks and months here on CDB TV, so now would be a very good time to subscribe to my channel in order that you don't miss out on future video postings. So right now we're going to take a look at another old British classic, but this particular bike wasn't really a bike at all originally, and it was all put together using different parts of BSA motorcycles. So let's get straight into that video and take a look at Steve Parkin's 1971 B50T BSA. And so this quite nice looking 1971 BSA B50T is another one of those motorcycles that began its life as not really a bike at all, because this bike was built by using up many of the spare BSA parts that the bike's owner had lying around his workshop. Now, the bike was built by classic racer Steve Parkin, and Steve's motivation to build this bike was that he needed a bike to take part in the annual Kendal Classic Nostalgia Scramble, which at that time was one of the major vintage scramble events that were held at Sedberg in Cumbria in the UK. And Steve also intended to use the bike to do some vintage enduros and some green laning as well, so it would have to have a full lighting kit and be registered for the road as well. Now, Steve already had quite a good selection of spare BSA parts that he could use on the build of this bike, but one of the major components that he needed was, of course, a chassis, because as you're aware, BSA frames aren't exactly freely available to buy second hand, but after many hours of surfing the internet, Steve did manage to find one, which was then immediately inspected for damage or wear before it was then prepped and then painted in this lovely 2-pack silver colour, before then being finished off with a further coat of hard-wearing anti-chip lacquer. And so when it came down to picking an engine for Steve's new BSA bike build, he did have quite a few parts that he could use to start building an engine, but he certainly didn't have enough to construct a complete motor. And again, after weeks of surfing and attending motorcycle jumbles to try and find the bits that he required, he eventually gave up on that idea of locating those missing components. But you'd certainly think that because we live here in the UK where these BSA bikes were made back in the day, then there'd be a plentiful supply of these old BSA B50 motors lying around. But you'd be surprised just how very few examples of these engines are still available. And of course, the other factor is that these B50s are well sought after by the classic and vintage racing fraternity, who certainly know the true value of these engines, and they do tend to hold on to them. And if they do end up selling one on the open market, then these power plants normally command top prices from potential buyers. So anyhow, as luck would have it, Steve did manage to locate a complete BSA B50 engine while he was at a local motorcycle bike jumble, and this motor here sitting in the frame was then given a complete strip down and rebuild, and it also underwent a bit of tuning and upgrades before its reassembly. But the particular specifications of this motor here is that it has been converted to full motocross specifications, and has also had some upgrades done on the ports just to improve gas flow around the cylinder. Now, the original cam was swapped for a high lift performance part, and the standard Amal concentric carburetor was then changed for a much larger carburetor to feed more fuel and air mixture into the motor. Now, again, on the transmission side, a stronger and more robust clutch was also fitted to help the close ratio gearbox transmit that B50 power down onto the back wheel. And other little touches like removing the original BSA foot pegs from the chassis and fitting these much wider and more comfortable steel ones will also make the bike a bit more user-friendly when it takes to the track. And again, the exhaust system on these B50 BSA engines was just a simple big bore straight through pipe that had a short stubby tail cone here at the side, which was very reminiscent of the old CCM bikes of the 1970s, but you can just imagine what a lovely sound that this pipe would make when that 500 4-stroke motor burst into life. So as we move on to the front end of our BSA now, these front forks were another of the many BSA parts that Steve had lying around his workshop, and after a complete refurbishment was carried out, these were then bolted on to the bike's chassis. But with regards these forks manufacture or origins, I'm not entirely sure, to tell you the truth, what make or model they are, but they could be the old BSA forks, or maybe even a set of metal profiles, which were a popular suspension system on these kind of bikes in the late 1960s and early 70s. Now, the wheels again were another of the parts that Steve had to try and find for his BSA build, and as second-hand parts couldn't be found, a brand new set of replacement alloy rims were then purchased, and these were relaced with brand new spokes onto the front and rear brake hubs. And so as far as the BSA's rear suspension was concerned, this was all sorted out by fitting a pair of classic Falcon gas shocks to the chassis and swing arm, and these British made Falcons are certainly good value for money, because I did use a similar pair of these old shocks on my 1980 Myco back in the day, and they seem to perform very well for such a basic rear suspension system setup. But the bike's alloy fuel tank is thankfully another one of the spare parts that Steve had sitting on a shelf in his garage, and after a good clean-up and some spit and polish and a brand new set of graphics, it was then refixed back onto that BSA frame, looking almost like brand new once again. Now, as I remember, I think these tanks did hold quite a decent amount of fuel in them, and certainly enough to keep that B50 BSA motor fed with fuel on even the longest of scrambles races. But it certainly looks like we have quite a decent seat on Steve's bike, and as far as I know, this was another part that was sourced from his BSA spare parts department at Steve's home, but that extra padding will certainly all help towards making the ride a bit more user-friendly over those bumpy racetracks. And let's face it, with the limited suspension movement that these bikes had at the back, every millimetre of padding in the seat will make the ride just that little bit smoother. But certainly the bike's front and rear mudguards are brand new plastic parts, and these universal motorcycle plastics were just a straightforward bolt-on job onto that BSA frame. And I expect that Steve could have picked any colour that took his fancy for these parts, but I do have to admit that these white ones certainly do fit in well with that silver frame and those red side panels. But up at the front we have a pair of rental handlebars and its crossbar pad there as well, and the clutch, brake and decompressor levers are all brand new parts. But because our BSA was also going to be used on the public highway, then naturally it had to be fitted with a full lighting kit and switchgear to make it road legal. Now, an engine kill switch is also bolted on to the right hand side of the bars should that BSA motor need to be shut down, but these engine kill switches are also a mandatory requirement if you want to go classic racing with certain organisations within the UK. And Steve's BSA also has the correct ignition panel and switch fitted here just underneath the fuel tank, complete of course with its BSA keyring as well. Now, Steve did tell me that the entire bike building project took him almost a full year to complete, because he was only doing very small amounts of work to the bike at weekends due to his heavy work commitments and other family stuff during the week. But of course, this BSA bike build project's not an original BSA because of some of the replacement parts that are bolted onto the bike, but essentially it's all based around a 1970s frame and engine. Although when you consider that this wasn't even a bike at all to begin with, Steve's certainly ended up with a very nice machine that he can use at either classic scrambles or vintage enduros. And when he's not riding the bike in the dirt or doing some green laning, then he can always head on down the highway and make the very best use of this lovely multi-purpose motorcycle. So I do hope you enjoyed that walk around Steve Parkin's quite nice 1971 BSA B50T, a bike, as I said, that wasn't really a bike at all originally, but all put together by Steve using most of the old BSA spare parts that he had lying around in his workshop. So coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at the late Ian Robertson's old YZ 400 Yamaha. Now this bike that you can see here is of course not an original YZ 400 Yamaha, but this was another one of the bikes that Ian built to be used as a race bike, and we'll be taking a look at Ian's YZ 400 when we return here to Classic Dirt Bike TV. But until the next time, everybody continue to be safe and well out there, and watch what you're doing with those old vintage race bikes and don't get yourself into any trouble. But we'll hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of this old school type of vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.